A young man raced through the crowded train station, his heart pounding and his mind consumed by a desperate urgency. Kelvin had one chance to land a job that could save his mother from mounting medical bills. Every step brought him closer to the interview, which could change his life. Yet fate had other plans. In the chaos of Grand Station, Kelvin's eyes fell upon an elderly man, lost and struggling at the top of a staircase. Torn between his need to press forward and the voice in his heart urging him to stop, Kelvin made a decision that would alter the course of his future forever. Little did he know, this simple act of kindness would lead to an encounter far beyond anything he could have imagined. Before we dive into the compelling story of Kelvin's courage and selflessness, comment below where you're watching from today. If you find stories like this inspiring and meaningful, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss one. Kelvin walked briskly through the crowded Grand Station, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded jacket. His heart pounded with nervous anticipation, his mind juggling thoughts of the job interview he had in less than an hour. It was a rare opportunity, one he couldn't afford to miss. The early morning rush had subsided, leaving the terminal busy but less chaotic than usual. Still, Kelvin felt the weight of every passing minute as he maneuvered his way through the throng. "Excuse me, sorry," he muttered as he sidestepped a hurried traveler dragging a clunky suitcase. His worn sneakers squeaked against the tiled floor, the loose laces threatening to trip him. He'd already tied them twice that morning, a detail that somehow reflected the fragility of his situation. Kelvin's backpack, heavy with his meager belongings and a borrowed folder for the interview, seemed to tug him backward, a reminder of all he carried on his shoulders. At 19, Kelvin had already endured more than many his age. His mother, once the pillar of their small family, now lay bedridden at home, her health rapidly deteriorating. The medical bills piled up faster than they could manage, and every failed job interview felt like another nail in their hopes for relief. This job was more than just employment, it was a lifeline. Kelvin glanced up at the station's grand clock. He was still on time, barely. He quickened his pace, weaving through the clusters of commuters, and adjusted the strap of his backpack. He knew the building where his interview would be held was just a few blocks away, but first he had to escape the labyrinth of the terminal. That's when he saw him, a frail-looking elderly man standing near the top of a staircase. The man clutched a white cane under one arm, his head swiveling side to side, his expression a blend of confusion and unease. His lips moved silently as though he was asking for help, but the words were drowned out by the buzz of the station. Kelvin's first instinct was to look away and keep moving. He had somewhere to be, after all, and this interview was critical. Someone else would surely help, he reasoned. Yet, as he continued forward, he couldn't shake the image of the old man. The man's trembling hands and furrowed brow lingered in Kelvin's mind like a stubborn echo. "Damn it," Kelvin muttered under his breath, turning on his heel. Against his better judgment, or perhaps driven by his best instincts, he pushed his way back through the crowd toward the man. "Hey, sir," Kelvin called out as he approached, raising his voice to cut through the surrounding noise. "Do you need help?" The man turned toward the voice, his face lighting up with a faint trace of relief. "Oh, thank you, young man," the elder said, his voice quivering. "These stairs, they're a bit too much for me. I can't see well enough to manage them." Kelvin glanced at his watch again. Time was slipping away, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the man stranded. "No problem, sir," Kelvin said, stepping beside him and offering his arm. "I'll help you down." The old man hesitated before reaching out, his bony fingers gripping Kelvin's forearm with surprising strength. "You're very kind," he murmured as Kelvin guided him down the stairs, one deliberate step at a time. The descent was slow, each movement deliberate to ensure the man didn't lose his footing. Kelvin ignored the annoyed sighs and muttered complaints from impatient commuters as they brushed past. One man bumped Kelvin's shoulder and shot him a scathing look, muttering about people blocking the way, but Kelvin didn't flinch. His focus remained on the old man. "You're doing great, sir," Kelvin said gently, though his voice carried a note of urgency. "Just a few more steps." "Thank you," the old man replied, his voice soft. "I don't know what I would have done without you." As they reached the bottom of the staircase, the man introduced himself as Bernard, a retired professional who had come to the city for personal business. He offered Kelvin a warm, genuine smile that seemed to erase years from his weathered face. "It's really no problem," Kelvin said, trying to brush off the gratitude. "Are you okay from here?" Bernard nodded, though he still appeared slightly disoriented. Yes. You've been a tremendous help. Thank you." Kelvin nodded in return, glancing one last time at the massive clock in the terminal. His stomach sank. He was already late, and his chances of making a good impression were slim. Still, as he walked away, a small flicker of satisfaction lingered in his chest. He had done the right thing. Kelvin moved swiftly through the terminal, his heart pounding against his ribs. He was running out of time. The satisfaction of helping Bernard still lingered, but it was now overshadowed by the cold realization that he might have cost himself the interview. The massive doors of the terminal loomed ahead, sunlight streaming through the glass panes. Kelvin pushed forward, dodging the crowds with practiced ease. His mind raced with excuses he could give the receptionist or interviewer. "I got stuck in traffic," or "Frere. There was a delay on the subway" sounded plausible. He couldn't exactly say, "I stopped to help an old man," without risking being brushed off as unprofessional. Before he could make it out the door, a stern voice called out behind him. "Hey, you there?" Kelvin froze, his breath hitching in his throat. Turning, he saw a security guard striding toward him. The man was tall, with a build that made him look more suited for a boxing ring than a train station. Kelvin recognized him immediately. It was the same guard who had been eyeing him earlier while he helped Bernard. The guard's expression was a mixture of suspicion and authority. His sharp gaze made Kelvin's stomach churn. "Bookmark, go back." "What were you doing back there?" the guard demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. Kelvin blinked, his confusion giving way to frustration. "I was helping an older gentleman down the stairs. He couldn't manage on his own." The guard raised an eyebrow, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Helping, huh? You sure you weren't trying to pick his pocket or scam him?" The accusation hit Kelvin like a punch to the gut. His cheeks flushed with heat, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. He had been through this before, misjudged, suspected, and treated as guilty without evidence. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," Kelvin said, keeping his voice steady but firm. "The man needed help, so I helped him. That's all." The guard narrowed his eyes, studying Kelvin like a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The tension between them was palpable, and Kelvin could feel the eyes of passers-by on him. He hated this, being stared at, judged, and labeled before anyone knew his story. "Watch yourself," the guard finally said, his voice low but heavy with implication. "People might not be as understanding as me next time." Kelvin bit back the retort that burned on his tongue. Instead, he nodded curtly and turned away, his jaw clenched tightly. The encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he couldn't afford to let it rattle him. Not now. He burst through the terminal doors and into the bustling city streets. The building where his interview was scheduled was just a block away. His legs moved automatically, carrying him forward even as doubt gnawed at his mind. He didn't know what kind of impression he'd make showing up late, but he had to try. Kelvin reached the building, its glass facade gleaming under the morning sun. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack. Taking a deep breath, he pushed through the revolving doors and approached the reception desk. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with glasses perched on the edge of her nose, barely looked up as Kelvin approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone brisk. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here for an interview," Kelvin said, his voice faltering slightly. "It was scheduled for 10 o'clock, but I—" The receptionist glanced at the clock on the wall, her expression softening only slightly as she cut him off. "I'm sorry. The interviews ended 15 minutes ago." Kelvin's shoulders slumped, the weight of the words settling heavily on him. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was late because he stopped himself. The truth didn't matter here. Is there any way I can reschedule?" The woman sighed, finally looking up at him. She saw something in his expression, perhaps desperation, perhaps hope, and her own softened in response. "You can try again next week," she said gently. Kelvin nodded, forcing a polite smile even as his chest tightened. "Thank you," he murmured. The words felt hollow, but he didn't know what else to say. As he turned and walked out of the building, the sting of disappointment settled deep within him. The interview hadn't just been an opportunity for him. It had been a chance to provide for his mother, to ease her pain, to lighten their load. And now, it was gone. The streets outside felt colder, harsher, and busier than they had that morning. Kelvin shoved his hands into his pockets, his head hung low as he walked back toward the station. Each step felt heavier than the last. But as his mind churned over the loss, a flicker of memory broke through the gloom. Bernard's grateful smile as he thanked Kelvin at the bottom of the stairs. The man's words came back to him, soft but sincere. "Thank you, young man. You don't know how much this means to me." Kelvin took a deep breath, his chest tightening with a different kind of emotion now. Perhaps, he thought, the day wasn't a total loss. He hadn't secured a job, but he had done something that mattered. He had helped someone when no one else would. Still, the thought did little to ease the gnawing anxiety about the future. As Kelvin turned the corner to head home, he resolved to keep trying. Somehow, someway, he'd find another opportunity. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets as Kelvin made his way back to the small apartment he shared with his mother. His steps were slower now, each one weighed down by the disappointment clinging to him like a shadow. By the time he reached the worn wooden steps leading to their front door, Kelvin's mind was already spinning with plans for the next day. Maybe the library had new job postings, or maybe one of the cafes nearby needed help. Anything would do. As Kelvin fished his keys out of his pocket, a voice startled him from behind. "Excuse me, young man." Kelvin turned, blinking in surprise. Standing a few feet away was Bernard, the elderly man he had helped at the station. The man looked slightly more put together now, his cane firmly in hand and his posture straighter. Even so, his face still carried the faint flush of someone who had exerted themselves too much. "Mr. Bernard?" Kelvin asked, his surprise evident. "What are you doing here?" Bernard offered a kind smile, his glasses catching the sunlight. "I thought I might see you again before I left the city. I wasn't sure where to find you, but then I saw you walking this way." Kelvin glanced around, still processing the sight of the man standing outside his home. "You didn't have to come all this way, sir," he said. "Is everything okay?" Bernard nodded, tapping his cane lightly on the ground. Yes. I just wanted to thank you again, properly this time. What you did for me earlier was more than a small kindness. It was something I won't forget." Kelvin shifted uncomfortably, scratching the back of his neck. It really wasn't a big deal. Anyone would have done the same. Bernard's expression grew serious, and he shook his head. "No, not everyone would. The world is full of people who walk past without a second glance. But you stopped. That means something, young man." Kelvin didn't know what to say to that. He had spent so much time being dismissed or overlooked that hearing someone acknowledge his actions felt foreign. "Thank you, sir," Kelvin said softly. Bernard reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small card. "Here," he said, handing it to Kelvin. Kelvin took it, his fingers brushing against the textured paper. The card was simple, with only a name, R. Bernard, and a phone number printed neatly in the center. No title, no company logo, just a name. "If there's ever anything you need," Bernard said, his voice steady, "call me. I'm not very used to my own these days, but I still have some connections. A young man like you deserves a chance to show what he can do." Kelvin stared at the card, the words not quite sinking in. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't need to say anything," Bernard replied with a smile. "Just promise me you won't give up. You've got something in you, and the world needs more people like that." Before Kelvin could respond, Bernard patted his shoulder gently and began to turn away, his cane clicking softly against the pavement. "Take care of yourself, Kelvin," he called over his shoulder. Kelvin watched the man shuffle down the street until he disappeared around the corner. The card in his hand felt heavier than it should have, its presence a strange mix of hope and disbelief. He slipped it into his pocket, unsure of whether he'd ever actually use it. Inside the apartment, the faint sound of his mother coughing reached Kelvin as he closed the door behind him. He dropped his bag near the entryway and hurried to her room. "Mom?" he called softly. His mother was propped up against a pile of pillows, a thin blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked pale, but managed a tired smile when she saw him. "Kelvin, you're back," she said, her voice weak but warm. Kelvin sat down on the edge of her bed, taking her hand gently. "How are you feeling?" "About the same," she admitted, giving his hand a light squeeze. "How did the interview go?" Kelvin hesitated, his gaze dropping to the worn carpet beneath his feet. "I didn't make it in time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother's brow furrowed, and she reached up to brush a strand of hair away from his forehead. "Oh, Kelvin," she said softly, "what happened?" He let out a heavy sigh, leaning back slightly. "I stopped to help someone at the station. An older man needed help down the stairs, and I couldn't just leave him there. It felt like the right thing to do." His mother's face softened, a flicker of pride shining through her exhaustion. "That's because it was the right thing to do," she said firmly. "I know how much this job meant to you, but sometimes doing the right thing means taking a harder road." Kelvin nodded, though the sting of disappointment still clung to him. I wanted to make things better for us," he said, his voice tight. "You will," his mother said, her hand squeezing him again. "I believe in you, Kelvin. And you should believe in yourself too." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. Then Kelvin remembered the card Bernard had given him. He pulled it from his pocket and handed it to his mother. "What's this?" she asked, squinting at the small print. "It's from the man I helped," Kelvin explained. "He said I could call him if I needed anything. I don't know if he meant it or if he was just being polite, but—" His mother looked at the card, then back at him, her expression thoughtful. "You never know, Kelvin. Sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places." Kelvin smiled faintly, pocketing the card again. "We'll see, Mom, we'll see." That night, as he lay in bed, Kelvin stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the day. Bernard's words echoed in his ears, mingling with his mother's quiet encouragement. For the first time in a while, the weight on his chest felt just a little lighter. The next morning, Kelvin woke to the sound of birds chirping outside his window. The faint light of dawn filtered through the thin curtains, illuminating his modest room. For a brief moment, he let himself enjoy the quiet. But as reality settled in, the weight of yesterday's disappointment returned. Kelvin stretched, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and glanced at the crumpled pile of clothes on the floor, his best outfit, worn to the interview he never got to attend. A pang of frustration coursed through him, but he shook it off. Today was a new day, and he had no choice but to keep moving forward. He moved through his morning routine quickly, grabbing a piece of toast from the kitchen before checking in on his mother. She was still asleep, her face peaceful against the pillow. Kelvin smiled faintly, thankful for the rare moment of calm. Just as he was about to head to the library to hunt for new job postings, a sharp knock at the door startled him. Kelvin frowned, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was too early for visitors, and they rarely had any to begin with. He opened the door cautiously, and his breath caught in his throat. A sleek black car was parked at the curb outside, its polished exterior gleaming in the morning sun. Standing on the porch was a man in a crisp suit, his posture straight and professional. "Are you Kelvin?" the man asked, his voice polite but firm. Kelvin nodded slowly, his mind racing. "Yeah, that's me. Can I help you?" The man extended a cream-colored envelope, the paper thick and embossed with elegant lettering. "This is for you," he said. "For Mr. Bernard. He asked that I deliver it personally." Kelvin took the envelope with trembling hands, his heart pounding in his chest. "Mr. Bernard?" he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the man replied with a small nod. "He wanted to express his gratitude for your assistance yesterday. He also left instructions for further arrangements, should you choose to accept." Before Kelvin could ask any questions, the man gave a polite nod, turned, and walked back to the car. The vehicle pulled away smoothly, leaving Kelvin standing on the porch with the mysterious envelope in his hands. Kelvin closed the door behind him, leaning against it for support. His fingers fumbled as he tore open the envelope, revealing a neatly folded letter inside. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten words. "Dear Kelvin, your act of kindness yesterday did not go unnoticed. In a world where so many are too busy to care for others, your selflessness stands out as a rare and admirable quality. I was deeply moved by your willingness to help me, even at great personal cost to yourself. I would like to offer you an opportunity. Attached is an invitation to join my company as an intern. It may not seem like much at first, but I believe in your potential, and I am confident you will make the most of this chance. My driver will pick you up tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. should you choose to accept. I hope to see you there. Warm regards, R. Bernard. Kelvin's hands trembled as he read the letter again and then a third time just to be sure he hadn't misunderstood. His mind swirled with disbelief and questions. An internship at Mr. Bernard's company? He barely knew the man, yet here he was, offering Kelvin a chance to change his life. Kelvin? His mother's voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her standing in the doorway of her room, a blanket draped over her thin shoulders. Concern flickered in her tired eyes. Who was at the door? She asked, her voice soft but curious. Kelvin hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and handing her the letter. It was someone sent by Mr. Bernard, he said. The man I helped yesterday. He's offering me a job, an internship at his company. His mother's eyes widened as she read the letter, her expression shifting from confusion to astonishment. By the time she finished, tears glistened in her eyes. Oh, Kelvin, she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. This is incredible. Kelvin sat beside her, still holding the now empty envelope. I don't know, Mom. It feels too good to be true. Why would someone like him want to help me? His mother placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm despite her frailty. Because, Kelvin, sometimes the world recognizes when someone does something good. You've worked so hard and you deserve this chance. Don't doubt it. Embrace it. Her words lingered in the air, a quiet reassurance that Kelvin hadn't realized he needed. He nodded slowly, a small spark of hope igniting in his chest. The next day, Kelvin woke earlier than usual, his nerves already alight with anticipation. He took extra care getting ready, ironing his shirt and combing his hair as best he could. The reflection staring back at him in the mirror looked more confident than he felt, but he was determined to make the most of this opportunity. By the time the black car arrived at 10 a.m. sharp, Kelvin was waiting on the porch, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The driver stepped out, opened the door for him with a polite nod, and Kelvin slid into the back seat. The ride to Mr. Bernard's office was smooth and quiet, the city's skyline growing larger with each passing mile. Kelvin stared out the window, his thoughts a jumble of excitement and apprehension. He had no idea what awaited him at the company, but he knew this was a chance he couldn't afford to waste. When the car finally pulled up in front of a towering glass building, Kelvin felt his breath catch. This was unlike anything he had ever seen, sleek, modern, and intimidating. The driver opened the door for him again, and Kelvin stepped out, clutching his backpack tightly. As he entered the building, the cool blast of air conditioning hit him, and he straightened his posture. This was it, his new beginning. Kelvin stood in the lobby of the glass building, his gaze sweeping over the polished floors and high ceilings. The space buzzed with energy, the quiet hum of professionalism in every corner. People moved with purpose, their sharp suits and confident strides a stark contrast to Kelvin's slightly wrinkled shirt and scuffed shoes. He approached the reception desk hesitantly, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The receptionist, a woman with neatly tied hair and an immaculate blazer, greeted him with a polite smile. Good morning, she said. You must be Kelvin. Kelvin nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and relief. Yes, ma'am. I'm here for the internship. The receptionist's smile widened. Mr. Bernard is expecting you. Take the elevator to the 12th floor. Thank you, Kelvin replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As he stepped into the sleek elevator, he couldn't help but glance at his reflection in the mirrored walls. He adjusted his shirt, tugged at the straps of his backpack, and took a deep breath. The ride felt like an eternity as the numbers climbed higher and higher. When the door slid open, Kelvin stepped into a quiet hallway. The walls were lined with framed photographs of cityscapes and smiling employees. At the end of the corridor was a large door with R. Bernard etched onto a polished nameplate. Kelvin approached cautiously, his heart pounding. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated. What if this was all a mistake? What if he wasn't cut out for this? Pushing the doubts aside, he knocked softly. Come in, a voice called from the other side. Kelvin pushed the door open and stepped inside. Mr. Bernard sat behind a large wooden desk, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked up, a warm smile spreading across his face as he saw Kelvin. "Ah, Kelvin. I'm glad you came," Bernard said, standing and extending a hand. Kelvin shook it, his grip firm despite his nerves. "Thank you for inviting me, sir." "I didn't expect this." Bernard gestured for him to sit in one of the chairs in front of the desk. "Please, have a seat. And don't worry, I understand this might all feel a bit overwhelming." Kelvin sat down, his back straight as he tried to compose himself. Bernard leaned back in his chair, studying him with an expression that was both kind and analytical. "I wanted to meet you personally before we got started," Bernard began. "What you did for me yesterday, it wasn't just a simple act of kindness. It was a reflection of the character of integrity. That's what we value here." Kelvin's cheeks warmed and he looked down at his hands. I saw someone who needed help. It didn't seem like a big deal." "It may not have seemed like one to you," Bernard said, "but it was to me. And it's the kind of attitude that makes a real difference, not just in life, but in the workplace. That's why I've offered you this internship." Kelvin nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Bernard smiled. "I believe you. Now let's get you started." After their brief meeting, Bernard introduced Kelvin to Clara, a young woman with sharp eyes and a friendly smile. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored blazer and heels that clicked softly against the floor as she walked. "Kelvin, this is Clara," Bernard said. "She'll be your mentor during the internship. If you have any questions or need help, she's the one to ask." Clara extended a hand, her grip firm and confident. "Welcome aboard, Kelvin. It's good to have you here." "Thank you," Kelvin replied, shaking her hand. Bernard excused himself, leaving Clara to show Kelvin around. She guided him through the office, pointing out various departments and introducing him to colleagues. Everyone seemed polite but busy, offering quick smiles and nods before returning to their tasks. "This is where you'll be working," Clara said, stopping in front of a small desk tucked in a quiet corner. "It's not glamorous, but it's yours. You'll be handling data entry and assisting with some basic research at first. It might seem tedious, but it's important work." Kelvin nodded, running a hand over the smooth surface of the desk. "Thank you." Clara smiled. "Good attitude. That'll take you far." Kelvin's first task was simple, organizing client files and entering data into the system. The work was repetitive but manageable, and Kelvin threw himself into it with determination. He wanted to prove himself, not just to Mr. Bernard and Clara, but to himself. Hours passed as he worked, the steady rhythm of his typing blending with the faint hum of the office. Occasionally, Clara would stop by to check on him, offering pointers or answering questions. "You're catching on quickly," she said during one visit, nodding approvingly at his progress. "Thanks," Kelvin said, a small smile tugging at his lips. By noon, Kelvin's stomach was growling, but he hesitated to leave his desk. He didn't want to seem ungrateful or unmotivated. Clara, however, wasn't having it. "Go grab some lunch," she said, leaning against his desk. "There's a great sandwich shop down the street. You'll need the energy for the rest of the day." Kelvin hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Okay, thanks, Clara." He stepped outside, the fresh air a welcome change from the cool, sterile environment of the office. The sandwich shop Clara recommended was small but cozy, and the scent of freshly baked bread filled the air. Kelvin ordered a simple turkey sandwich and took a seat by the window. As he ate, he pulled out his phone and called his mother. "Kelvin, how's it going?" she asked, her voice brighter than usual. "It's good, Mom," he said, smiling. "I'm learning a lot and everyone's been really nice." "I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice softening. "I knew you'd make the most of this." Kelvin's chest tightened with emotion. "Thanks, Mom. I'll call you when I'm done for the day, okay?" "All right, honey. I love you. Love you too." After finishing his lunch, Kelvin returned to the office with renewed focus. He tackled the afternoon's tasks with the same determination, eager to absorb everything he could. By the time the day ended, his body was tired, but his spirit felt lighter. As he rode the elevator down to the lobby, Kelvin allowed himself a small smile. It wasn't easy, and he had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he belonged. Kelvin woke up the next morning, feeling an unfamiliar mix of exhaustion and excitement. His first day at the company had been a whirlwind of introductions, tasks, and navigating an environment that felt completely foreign to him. Despite the challenges, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment lingering in the back of his mind. After a quick breakfast, he kissed his mother on the cheek before heading out to the waiting car. The driver gave him a polite nod, the same as the day before, and Kelvin slid into the back seat. As the car wove through the busy streets, Kelvin stared out the window, his thoughts filled with what the day might hold. When they arrived at the office, Kelvin stepped out, adjusted his shirt, and walked through the towering glass doors. He was beginning to grow familiar with the flow of the morning, polished professionals chatting in the lobby, the faint click of heels on marble floors, and the hum of energy that filled the space. Clara greeted him at his desk with her usual bright smile, a stack of folders already in her hands. "Morning, Kelvin," she said, placing the folders in front of him. "Ready for another day?" Kelvin smiled back, his nerves less pronounced than the day before. "Ready as I'll ever be." "Good," Clara said, tapping the top of the pile. "Today, I want you to start getting familiar with our client projects. These folders contain summaries, reports, and data from some of our most recent campaigns. It's a lot to take in, but don't worry, we'll go through it step by step." Kelvin nodded, flipping open the first folder. Pages of graphs, charts, and typed notes stared back at him, their complexity both daunting and intriguing. For the next few hours, Kelvin immersed himself in the work. He read through the files carefully, jotting down notes and questions as he went. Some terms and concepts went over his head, but he refused to let that discourage him. Clara stopped by periodically to check on his progress. Her guidance was both patient and encouraging. "You're picking this up faster than most," she said during one visit, glancing over his notes. "Keep it up." "Thanks," Kelvin replied, his confidence growing with each small victory. By mid-morning, Clara appeared again, this time with a more serious expression. "Kelvin, I need you to join me in a meeting," she said. Kelvin's stomach did a small flip. "A meeting? Already?" Clara smiled, her tone reassuring. "Don't worry, you're not presenting or anything. I just want you to observe. It'll give you a better sense of how we handle client interactions and what's expected in these kinds of discussions." Kelvin nodded, grabbing his notepad and pen. "I'm ready." The meeting was held in a sleek conference room with a long glass table and large windows overlooking the city. When Kelvin stepped inside, he saw Mr. Bernard standing near the window, deep in conversation with a sharply dressed man and woman. "Ah, Kelvin," Bernard said, his expression warm. "Glad you could join us." Kelvin nodded politely, taking a seat beside Clara. He felt small compared to the polished professionals around him, but he reminded himself that this was part of the learning process. The meeting began, and Kelvin quickly realized just how much he had to learn. The conversation flowed seamlessly between Bernard, Clara, and the clients, with terms and strategies that sounded like another language to him. He scribbled notes furiously, trying to keep up with the rapid exchange of ideas. Despite the overwhelming pace, Kelvin couldn't help but be fascinated. He watched how Bernard commanded the room with confidence and clarity, how Clara supported him with detailed insights, and how the clients responded with respect and trust. It was a dance, a carefully choreographed exchange of information and persuasion. After the meeting concluded, Kelvin lingered as the others filed out. Bernard approached him, a knowing smile on his face. "Well, Kelvin, what did you think?" Bernard asked. Kelvin hesitated, gathering his thoughts. "It was a lot," he admitted, "but it was incredible to see how everything works. I've read about meetings like that, but seeing it in person is so different. There's so much to learn." Bernard nodded, his expression pleased. "And you will learn. You're here because I see potential in you, Kelvin. Don't forget that." "Thank you, sir," Kelvin said, his voice steady and determined. "I won't let you down." Bernard smiled, patting Kelvin on the shoulder. "I know you won't." The rest of the day was a blur of activity. Kelvin returned to his desk, diving back into the client files with renewed focus. The notes he had taken during the meeting helped clarify some of the concepts that had confused him earlier, and he began to see the bigger picture of how the company operated. Clara stopped by in the afternoon, her arms crossed as she leaned against his desk. "You survived your first meeting," she teased, her tone light. Kelvin chuckled, looking up from his notes. Barely. But it was amazing. I learned so much just by watching you and Mr. Bernard. Clara smiled, her pride evident. That's the key. Watch, listen, and learn. You're doing great, Kelvin. Keep at it. As the day wound down, Kelvin found himself reflecting on how far he had come in such a short time. Just days ago, he had been standing in a crowded train station, unsure of where his next opportunity would come from. Now he was here, learning, growing, and beginning to believe in himself. The ride home that evening felt different. The city lights blurred past the window, and Kelvin leaned back in his seat, allowing himself a rare moment of pride. When he walked through the door of his apartment, his mother was waiting for him in her usual spot. Her face lit up as he set his bag down and sat beside her. "How was today?" she asked eagerly. Kelvin smiled, taking her hand. "It was good, Mom. I learned a lot. And I think I'm starting to find my place." Her eyes shone with pride as she squeezed his hand. "I always knew you would." Kelvin leaned back, letting her words settle in his mind. For the first time, he felt like he was truly building something, not just for himself, but for both of them. The next morning, Kelvin arrived at the office with a sense of growing confidence. Each day brought its challenges, but he was slowly finding his rhythm. Clara greeted him with her usual cheerful energy, handing him another stack of folders. "Morning, Kelvin. How's the intern life treating you so far?" she asked with a grin. "It's definitely keeping me busy," Kelvin replied, returning her smile. "But I think I'm getting the hang of it." "Good. That's what I like to hear," Clara said. "Keep it up, and we might have to start giving you the harder stuff." Kelvin chuckled, though a part of him was eager for the challenge. The morning passed quickly, as Kelvin buried himself in his work. He was reviewing client data when Clara appeared at his desk, her expression softer than usual. She held a small envelope in her hand. "Kelvin, Mr. Bernard asked me to give you this," she said, setting the envelope on his desk. Kelvin blinked, puzzled. "What is it?" Clara shrugged lightly, but her eyes gleamed with a knowing look. "Why don't you open it and find out?" Kelvin picked up the envelope. Its weight was light but meaningful. He carefully tore it open and pulled out a folded note. As he unfolded the paper, something else fell into his lap, a check. His eyes widened as he glanced at the amount, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't an extravagant sum, but it was enough to cover a significant portion of his mother's medical bills. Kelvin stared at the check, disbelief and gratitude swirling within him. The note read, "Kelvin, your determination and selflessness continue to impress me. Please consider this a small gesture of my gratitude. I hope it will ease some of the burden you and your mother are facing. You deserve the chance to focus on building your future without carrying the weight of her care alone. Warm regards, R. Bernard." Kelvin read the note twice, his hands trembling. He could feel his eyes stinging, but he blinked back the tears. Looking up at Clara, he found her watching him with a kind smile. "Is this real?" Kelvin asked, his voice barely audible. Clara nodded. "It's real. Mr. Bernard doesn't do things halfway, Kelvin. He sees potential in you and wants to help." For a moment, Kelvin didn't know what to say. The weight of his mother's illness and the constant worry about their finances had been a relentless presence in his life. To have even a fraction of that burden lifted felt almost too good to be true. "I don't know how to thank him," Kelvin finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Clara rested a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's thanks enough." Kelvin stepped outside during his lunch break, the check still tucked safely in his pocket. The crisp air helped him steady himself as he pulled out his phone and dialed his mother's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice brighter than usual. "Kelvin, is everything okay?" "Yeah, Mom," Kelvin said, his voice trembling slightly. I have some good news." His mother's tone shifted, her concern melting into curiosity. "What is it?" "Mr. Bernard. He gave us some money. Enough to help with your treatments," Kelvin said, his words rushing out in a single breath. There was silence on the other end of the line before his mother let out a shaky sigh. "Kelvin? Are you serious?" "Yeah, Mom. It's real," Kelvin said, his eyes glancing at the folded check in his hand. "You're going to get the care you need." His mother's voice broke with emotion. "Oh, Kelvin, I don't even know what to say. It's incredible." Kelvin smiled, though his throat felt tight. "I know, Mom." Things are finally starting to look up. They stayed on the line for a few more minutes, exchanging words of love and hope. When Kelvin hung up, he took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Back at his desk, Kelvin returned to his work with a new fire in his heart. The gratitude he felt was overwhelming, and he wanted to repay Mr. Bernard's faith in him by giving everything he had to this opportunity. Clara checked in on him later in the afternoon, her warm demeanor making her presence a comfort. "You seem extra focused today," she remarked with a smile. Kelvin looked up from his files, a faint smile on his lips. I feel like I finally have a chance to make a difference. For my mom, for myself. It means a lot." Clara nodded, her expression understanding. "Hold on to that feeling, Kelvin. It'll carry you far." By the time the day ended, Kelvin felt exhausted but fulfilled. The check was still tucked safely in his pocket as he rode the elevator down to the lobby. Each step felt lighter than it had in weeks. When he arrived home, his mother was waiting for him, her eyes bright with hope. Kelvin handed her the check, watching as tears filled her eyes. "We're going to be okay, Mom," Kelvin said, his voice steady. His mother nodded, clutching the check to her chest. "Because of you, Kelvin, you've made this possible." That night, Kelvin lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The challenges ahead still loomed large, but for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel so daunting. With Mr. Bernard's support and his mother's unwavering belief in him, Kelvin felt like he could face anything. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind for Kelvin. The weight of his mother's medical bills had eased, and the renewed energy in her voice during their nightly phone calls gave him a reason to smile through the challenges of each workday. Yet, even as he settled into the rhythm of his internship, Kelvin couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the edge of something bigger. Clara noticed the shift in him. His focus sharpened, and his determination became even more palpable. She would often stop by his desk to check on him, and her words of encouragement were a steady source of motivation. Bookmark. One afternoon, as Kelvin worked through a particularly dense client report, Clara appeared at his desk with a thoughtful expression. "You've been doing great, Kelvin," she said, leaning against the desk. "So great, in fact, that Mr. Bernard wants to meet with you again." Kelvin froze, his pen hovering over the notepad he had been scribbling on. "Mr. Bernard? Did I do something wrong?" Clara laughed, shaking her head. "No, quite the opposite. He thinks it's time for you to take on a bigger challenge." The word sent a jolt of excitement and nervousness through Kelvin. "A bigger challenge? Like what?" Clara smiled knowingly. "Why don't you ask him yourself? He wants to see you in his office at 3. Kelvin glanced at the clock. It was already 2:45. By the time Kelvin reached Bernard's office, his nerves were in full swing. He knocked on the polished door, his heart pounding. "Come in," Bernard's familiar voice called. Kelvin stepped inside, and Bernard greeted him with his usual warm smile. The older man gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Kelvin, it's good to see you," Bernard said as Kelvin sat down. "How have you been finding the internship so far?" "It's been incredible, sir," Kelvin replied. "I've learned so much, and I'm grateful for the opportunity." "I'm glad to hear that," Bernard said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been keeping an eye on your progress, and Clara speaks very highly of you. She says you've been putting in the effort, and it shows." Kelvin felt a flicker of pride but remained humble. "I've just been trying to do my best, sir." Bernard's smile widened. "That's all anyone can ask. Now I think it's time we expand our horizons a bit. There's a project I'd like you to assist with, a chance for you to step out of your comfort zone and see what you're really capable of." Kelvin's eyes widened. "What kind of project?" Bernard picked up a folder from his desk and slid it across to Kelvin. "It's a client analysis for a new account we're onboarding. Clara will guide you, but I want you to take the lead on the initial research and present your findings to the team next week." The room seemed to tilt for a moment as Kelvin processed Bernard's words. "Me? Present to the team?" "Yes," Bernard said, his tone steady. "I know it's a lot to take on, but I believe you're ready for it. This is your chance to show us what you can do." Kelvin swallowed hard, the weight of the responsibility settling over him. "I won't let you down, sir." "I know you won't," Bernard said with a nod. Kelvin spent the next few days pouring himself into the project, The folder Bernard had given him was filled with data, charts, and client expectations that felt overwhelming at first. But with Clara's guidance, he began to break it down into manageable pieces. "Don't try to tackle it all at once," Clara advised during one of their late afternoon check-ins. "Focus on understanding the client's needs first, then figure out how our services can meet those needs." Kelvin nodded, jotting down her advice in his notebook. By the time the weekend rolled around, Kelvin had a clear plan. He spent hours at home going over his notes, crafting his presentation, and practicing in front of the mirror. His mother watched him with quiet pride, offering gentle encouragement when he stumbled over his words. "You're going to do great, Kelvin," she said one evening. "Just be yourself. That's what got you here." Her words stayed with him, a steadying mantra as the day of the presentation approached. When the day finally came, Kelvin walked into the conference room with his notes clutched tightly in his hand. The team was already seated, including Bernard and Clara, who gave him a reassuring nod. Kelvin took a deep breath and began his presentation. At first, his voice wavered slightly, but as he moved through his points, he found his footing. The confidence he had been building over the past weeks took hold, and his passion for the project shone through. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment before Bernard broke into a slow clap. "Well done, Kelvin," he said, his eyes filled with pride. "You've shown us not only that you're capable, but that you have the potential to lead." Clara beamed, her smile as bright as ever. "I couldn't agree more." Kelvin's chest swelled with pride as he returned to his seat. The road that had brought him here had been anything but easy, but at that moment, he felt like he had truly arrived. That evening, Kelvin called his mother to share the news. Her joy was palpable, her laughter ringing through the phone like music. "I knew it, Kelvin," she said. "You're proving to the world what I've always known. You're extraordinary." Kelvin smiled, his heart full. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." As he hung up the phone, Kelvin sat in the quiet of his apartment, reflecting on how far he had come. His journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The weeks following Kelvin's successful presentation were a whirlwind of activity and growth. He was no longer just the intern quietly working in the corner. He was becoming an integral part of the team. Bernard began assigning him more responsibilities, and Clara pushed him with tasks that challenged his abilities. Kelvin welcomed the pressure, knowing each new assignment was an opportunity to prove himself. His workdays were long and intense, but the sense of accomplishment he felt at the end of each day made it all worthwhile. One crisp morning, Kelvin arrived at the office to find a note from Bernard waiting on his desk. It was written in Bernard's familiar handwriting, brief but impactful. "Kelvin, your progress has been remarkable. Meet me in my office at 10 a.m. We need to discuss your next steps. R. Bernard." Kelvin's heart raced as he read the note. He quickly ran through possibilities in his mind. Was he being given another big project, or had he made a mistake? Shaking off the nerves, he reminded himself that Bernard wouldn't have called him in unless he saw potential for something positive. At precisely 10 a.m., Kelvin knocked on Bernard's office door. "Come in," Bernard called, his voice steady as always. Kelvin entered, his posture straight despite the nervous energy coursing through him. Bernard was seated behind his large desk, but this time, there was something different in his demeanor, a quiet excitement that Kelvin couldn't quite place. "Kelvin," Bernard said, gesturing for him to sit. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, sir," Kelvin replied as he took the seat across from him. Bernard folded his hands on the desk, his piercing gaze meeting Kelvin's. "I've been watching you closely these past weeks, and I'm continually impressed. You've not only met the expectations of this internship, you've exceeded them." Kelvin felt a rush of pride, but kept his expression steady. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." Bernard leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "You've earned it, and that's why I'm extending your internship with additional responsibilities. Effective immediately, you'll be working directly on client accounts under Clara's supervision. You've shown you can handle the pressure, and I believe you're ready for more." Kelvin's eyes widened. "Working directly with clients?" "Yes," Bernard confirmed. "It's a significant step forward, but I have no doubt you'll rise to the occasion." This is a chance for you to showcase not only your skills, but also your ability to connect with people, something that's just as important as technical knowledge in this business. Kelvin nodded, determination lighting up his expression. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. Bernard smiled. I know you won't. Now get to it. Clara is already preparing your first assignment. Kelvin's new role brought with it a mix of excitement and challenges. For the first time, he was part of the team handling actual client interactions. Clara worked closely with him, walking him through the nuances of communication, strategy, and problem-solving. This is where the real work happens, Clara explained during one of their meetings. It's not just about numbers or data, it's about understanding people and finding ways to meet their needs. Kelvin soaked in every word, eager to prove himself in this new capacity. His first assignment involved drafting a proposal for a prospective client, detailing how the company's services could address their unique challenges. It's a lot to take on, Clara admitted, handing him a thick packet of background information. But I think you're ready. Kelvin nodded, flipping through the pages. I'll do my best. I know you will, Clara said with a reassuring smile. Kelvin spent several days immersing himself in the project. He analyzed the client's needs, cross-referenced data, and crafted a detailed proposal. Clara reviewed his work along the way, providing constructive feedback that helped him refine his ideas. By the time the proposal was complete, Kelvin felt a surge of pride. This was his work, a reflection of everything he had learned and the effort he had poured into the task. On the day of the presentation, Kelvin joined Clara and Bernard in the conference room. The clients arrived shortly after, and Kelvin felt his nerves spike as he stood before them. You've got this, Clara whispered, giving him a quick nod. Kelvin took a deep breath and began. As he spoke, the initial nerves gave way to focus and confidence. He presented the proposal clearly and passionately, answering questions with poise and demonstrating a deep understanding of the client's challenges. When he finished, the room erupted in quiet but approving applause. The clients exchanged nods of agreement before turning to Bernard. We're impressed, one of them said. Your team clearly understands our needs. Let's move forward with the partnership. Kelvin's chest swelled with pride as Bernard smiled and shook the client's hands. Excellent decision, Bernard said. And I have to give credit to Kelvin here. He played a key role in preparing this proposal. The clients looked at Kelvin with newfound respect, offering words of praise before leaving the room. After the meeting, Bernard clapped Kelvin on the back. Well done, Kelvin. You've proven once again that you belong here. Clara grinned, her pride evident. I couldn't agree more. You handled that like a pro. Kelvin felt a warmth spread through him. Their words validated everything he had worked so hard for. That evening, Kelvin called his mother to share the good news. Her joy was contagious, her laughter filling the quiet of his apartment. Kelvin, I can't believe how far you've come, she said. I always knew you were capable, but seeing it all come together like this, it's amazing. Kelvin smiled, his heart full. Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you. As he hung up the phone, Kelvin reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few short months. The boy who had once felt lost and overlooked was now carving out a path for himself, a path built on hard work, resilience, and the kindness that had started it all. Kelvin arrived at the office early the next morning, a quiet determination etched into his features. The buzz of the day's success still lingered in his mind, but he knew there was no time to dwell on past accomplishments. There was more work to be done, and he was ready to face it. Clara greeted him near his desk, her usual energy even brighter today. Morning, Kelvin, she said, a proud smile playing on her lips. You're becoming the talk of the office, you know? Kelvin blinked in surprise. Me? Why? Clara chuckled, crossing her arms. Word spreads fast around here. That presentation yesterday? People are saying it was one of the best client pitches we've had in months. Even Mr. Bernard can't stop singing your praises. Kelvin felt a flush of pride and a flicker of disbelief. I was just doing my job, he said humbly. And you're doing it well, Clara replied. Keep it up, and you won't be an intern for long. The day was packed with activity. Kelvin found himself diving into a new set of projects, each one more complex than the last. Clara continued to mentor him, and her guidance and steady presence helped him navigate the challenges. By midday, Kelvin's phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Mom, don't forget to eat, Kelvin. I'm so proud of you. Love you." Kelvin smiled at the message, warmth spreading through his chest. Her encouragement was a constant reminder of why he worked so hard. He took a quick lunch break, returning to the same cozy sandwich shop down the street. As he sat by the window, nibbling on his sandwich, Kelvin allowed himself a moment to reflect. When he had first started this journey, the future had seemed uncertain, even bleak. Now it felt like he was standing at the edge of endless possibilities. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Later that afternoon, Bernard called Kelvin into his office once again. The older man's demeanor was as composed as ever, but there was an undeniable warmth in his eyes. "Kelvin," Bernard began, as Kelvin took a seat. "You've made extraordinary progress during your time here. Your work ethic, your willingness to learn, and your ability to adapt have all exceeded my expectations." "Thank you, sir," Kelvin said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Bernard leaned forward, clasping his hands on the desk. "I've been thinking about your future, not just here, but beyond this internship. I believe it's time we discuss what comes next." Kelvin's heart raced. "What do you mean, sir?" Bernard smiled. "I'd like to offer you a permanent position with the company. You've proven that you're not just capable, but an asset to this team. With some time and continued growth, I see you taking on a leadership role here." For a moment, Kelvin was speechless. The weight of Bernard's words settled over him, filling him with a sense of pride and gratitude he couldn't fully put into words. "Are you serious?" Kelvin finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Bernard chuckled. "I don't say things I don't mean, Kelvin. The offer is yours if you're willing to accept it." Kelvin nodded quickly, his chest swelling with emotion. "Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity." "I'm proud of you, Kelvin," Bernard said, "and I know you'll continue to make us proud." That evening, Kelvin shared the news with his mother. Her reaction was everything he had hoped for. "Oh, Kelvin," she said, tears shining in her eyes. "You've worked so hard for this. I'm so proud of you, and I know your father would be too." Kelvin swallowed hard, his own emotions threatening to spill over. "Thanks, Mom. I couldn't have done it without you." The two of them spent the evening talking about the future, about his plans for his career, about her ongoing treatments, and about the dreams that now felt within reach. As the weeks turned into months, Kelvin's role at the company continued to grow. He tackled every challenge with the same determination that had brought him this far, earning the respect of his colleagues and the trust of his mentors. His mother's health began to improve as well, thanks to the treatments that Bernard's generosity had made possible. Each time Kelvin saw her smile, it reminded him of why he had chosen to help Bernard that day at the station. One afternoon, as Kelvin worked on a new project, Bernard stopped by his desk. The older man placed a hand on Kelvin's shoulder, his expression one of quiet pride. "Kelvin," he said, "do you remember what I told you when you first started here?" Kelvin thought for a moment before nodding. "You said you saw potential in me, that I deserved a chance. And you've proven me right," Bernard said. "But more importantly, you've proven to yourself that you belong here. That's what matters most." Kelvin smiled, his chest swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, sir, for everything." That evening, as Kelvin walked home under the glow of the city lights, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The journey had been anything but easy, but every struggle, every moment of doubt had brought him to this point. He thought back to the day he had helped Bernard at the station, a simple act of kindness that had set everything in motion. It was a reminder that even the smallest choices could lead to life-changing opportunities. When Kelvin arrived home, his mother greeted him with her usual warmth. They sat together in the quiet of their small living room, talking about the day and dreaming about the future. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like a distant hope. It felt real, tangible, and bright. Kelvin knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he was ready to face them. With his mother by his side and the support of people who believed in him, he felt unstoppable. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Kelvin allowed himself a moment of reflection. He wasn't just building a career or a better life for himself and his mother, he was Otoy One Fun, building something much bigger. A legacy of resilience, kindness, and hope. And for the first time, Kelvin truly believed that the best was yet to come. The story of Kelvin is a powerful reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can create ripples that transform lives. Kelvin's journey, from a young man struggling to make ends meet to someone who earned respect and opportunity through perseverance and selflessness, highlights the importance of integrity and compassion in a world that often feels rushed and indifferent. This narrative teaches us that character is defined not by circumstances, but by choices. When Kelvin chose to help Bernard, he didn't do so expecting a reward. Yet his simple gesture of kindness led to life-changing opportunities. It's a testament to the idea that good deeds are often returned in ways we could never imagine. For Bernard, Kelvin's selflessness reignited a belief in the potential of younger generations, a belief that generosity and mentorship can empower those who need it most. Together, their stories weave a profound lesson. The bridges we build through kindness can carry us to brighter futures, not just for ourselves, but for others as well. Kelvin's story is a call to action for all of us to act with kindness, perseverance, and hope, no matter how daunting life's challenges may seem. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Did it remind you of your own experiences? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. We also want to hear about your own stories of resilience and kindness. Have you ever had a moment where a small act of kindness changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. We can't wait to read it. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss more meaningful stories like this one. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. And stay tuned for more uplifting narratives that remind us of the power of human connection.